the Friday Cocktail, presented by Anna Glowinsky.
We will be talking about Leonard Cohen, who he was many things. He was poet, novelist, songwriter, seeker. He definitely dug into things in a deep and philosophical way. Some things that people think made him truly unique is that his career didn't peak early. Some of his most celebrated work actually arrived in his 70s and 80s, which is unusual indeed. And it's also maybe considered one of those artists where often this is more found in the world of painting, but became perhaps even more celebrated after his death. Here to delve into that and into his life and into his work is David Shumway. Hello, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, really good, thanks. I saw you just listening there. Would you say that that is a fair comparison, or have you got another angle of looking at it, that Leonard Cohen was indeed one of those artists that sort of became even more celebrated after he passed?
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. He became more celebrated in the last years of his life than he had ever been before, and then his popularity continued to grow. And that's particularly unusual, I think, for popular musicians who, I mean, if they were very famous, they maintain their popularity. I mean, Paul McCartney is still beloved, but he's not more famous now than he was when the Beatles were being chased by mobs of young girls in the 60s. But Cohen really did become much more well-known and more beloved, and his passing seemed to have only increased interest in his work and his career.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been racking my brains to see if I can think of any other music artists in that realm, and I can't really. You know, my mind's going straight to sort of painters, Van Gogh, or, you know, those ones who put that. Why do you think that it worked out that way for him? Do you think it's because he's more of an actual true artist than other musicians?
Well, I'm not sure that's exactly right, but I think it's partly because he was a songwriter as much as a performer. His songs were widely recorded. In fact, I mean, his most popular song, Hallelujah, became popular because other people covered it. Many people didn't even know that Leonard wrote it until years after the song had been on everybody's lips. And I think songwriters do tend to have a longer lifespan than performers do. I mean, we're still listening to Cole Porter and Irving Berlin today, but we're not listening to Bing Crosby. So there's also, though, something about what I call in my essay in the book, Cohen's embrace of old age. Even, you know, Mick Jagger is still performing, and he's performing very well. I mean, recent Stones concerts I hear, and I attended one 10 years ago, and he was not a young man. I mean, he's a terrific performer, but he's still basically doing the same thing that he was doing when he was a young man. It's astonishing that he can. But Leonard's career was different. When he went out on those late tours after he had to return because his agent had stolen most of his wealth, these were the greatest shows of his career. He really became a much better performer, and he did that by presenting himself as an old man. I'm not pretending to be the 30-year-old who started this. I mean, he was an old man then, actually, for a popular musician in the late 60s, but still not that old. And he was performing in his 70s and embracing that fact.
Yeah, it really flips on its head that aspect of, relationship between young and old, and some performers who manage to keep it going. It's exactly what you're saying. They're amazing because they're able to cling on to youth longer than your average Joe, but he's actually turned that around. Look, I've got more questions about him and his life, but before we go into them, let's get to know you a little bit more, the research that you've done for this book, the gravitas that you've got for talking about Leonard Cohen. What's your background and why did you decide to write this book?
Well, so I'm professor of cultural studies. I teach film and literature and popular music. I've written books about all of those subjects. The book that I published just before The World of Leonard Cohen was a book called Rockstar, The Making of Cultural Icons from Elvis to Springsteen, which is an attempt to understand what these people meant beyond their simple contribution to music, but how they became symbols of things that went beyond that. Popular music in the 60s took on a much greater cultural significance, I argue, than it had previously. In the 40s and 50s, we recognized the popularity of a Frank Sinatra or an Elvis Presley, but people thought of them as almost inherently ephemeral. The songs they recorded, everybody predicted nobody would be listening to a few years later. And the fact that teenagers were their main fans so kind of cemented that notion. But it turned out, of course, that Elvis himself had an enormous impact, that people continued to listen to him for a long time afterwards. And then with the Beatles and other artists, Dylan, in the 60s, the perception that popular music is ephemeral and inherently insignificant changed. Bob Dylan goes on to win the Nobel Prize. You can't register greater cultural significance, really, than that. And so I didn't write about Leonard in the Rockstar book. Leonard, I think, is a rock star, but he's not a rock star exactly in the same way that Elvis or Springsteen or the Grateful Dead are, in part because the music he performs is generically not recognized as rock and roll by most people. On the other hand, he did enter the music world at the moment when rock and roll was the dominant form, and so he had to adapt to it. His performances, for example, after he begins to tour seriously, are with a band that one might call a rock band backing him, even if the music itself isn't exactly rock and roll. So my preparation for writing this book was really this interest in rock stars and their cultural role. I should also say that I'm particularly interested in singer-songwriters. So in addition to writing about Dylan, I've written about Joni Mitchell and James Taylor and others. And Cohen, I argue in the book, is really his music is not exactly singer-songwriter music in the sense that Taylor's or Mitchell's is, but it's there at the beginning of that movement, a shift from folk to singer-songwriter. Commercially, folk music is dying about the time that Leonard Cohen starts to record. And this new formation, which shifts the focus of songs from sort of the idea of singing for the people, which is the basic idea of folk music in the late 50s and early 60s, to personal expression. That's the difference between those two movements, and Leonard is there at the start of that.
You've obviously done a ton of research on the cultural context of his music at that time, you know, what society's saying, feeling. What about getting inside his head? How close do you feel you got to understanding him as a person, as an artist, the things that he wanted to express and say?
Well, I certainly think I got closer after having worked on this book. But I also have to say that I think there are things that remain mysterious. He's a very complicated man. He's full of contradictions. I mean, some of them are really plain. I mean, he's a deeply religious man who was also one of the most overtly sensual or sexually explicit singers or songwriters that we've ever had. Normally, we think of those two things as not congruent with each other. In some way or another, Leonard seems to have thought that one got to the spiritual through the carnal, which is it's not an unprecedented point of view. There are other sages and thinkers who have held that position, but it's not a very common one. And then, you know, there's a sense that he was a man who constantly was in love in some way or another. Love is a concern of his, and yet he never really had a stable relationship with a woman throughout his entire career. I mean, he had brief relationships that were significant to him and emotionally important, but none of them lasted. It's unusual for someone to be that concerned with these issues and yet not have found that kind of love or that kind of stability, which most people seek. I mean, he clearly did not.
So would you say that gave him a sense of self, a sense of confidence in who he was? Or would you say it's the complete opposite? He was someone who was constantly trying to find who he was, how he felt about things, and explore that side? Well,
I think as with most things about Leonard, it's both. It was extraordinary sense of confidence. It's partly what made him a seductive man. I mean, he just assumed that women were interested in him, and he was usually right. But on the other hand, it's clear from his, it's not clear, but one could guess from his history of depression and substance abuse that he also had real questions about himself. And he was a seeker all his life. He was constantly trying to find something. What he was seeking, I think, is itself a little bit unclear. But when one goes to a Buddhist monastery and spends many years in that kind of discipline, that's an indication that you are, I would say, looking for something that you haven't found yet. And then, I mean, after he spent all of that time on Mount Baldy as a Buddhist monk, he then went off and studied with a Hindu sage. The specific discipline is Vedanta in India. And there are some people who think that actually that final religious or spiritual pilgrimage, Leonard would not call it religious. Leonard always said, my religion is Judaism. I'm perfectly happy with that. But I'm looking for something else from these Eastern philosophies or disciplines. But anyway, that Vedanta was really the thing that finally brought him out of his depression and partly helped him to be more at peace with himself in his last decade or so.
And when you're sort of looking into that, I mean, there are forums absolutely dedicated to trying to make sense of his lyrics, the way that he pieced them together, the music, people trying to take their own meaning, I suppose, from his songs, from his work. What route do you go down in your book? Are you answering questions that these forum keyboard warriors will have, the answers by going into your book? Or is it more an overview of his life, the things that he did, like a timeline, a chronology?
Well, there's a chapter in the book devoted to his songwriting, and another chapter devoted specifically to his albums as works of art in themselves. But I would not say that the primary focus of the book is the interpretation of his lyrics. That certainly happens over and over again. People offer readings of his songs, but more often in the service of trying to understand some larger point about him. And I think it's so. One example, there's a chapter on Leonard and Buddhism, and that chapter shows how many of Leonard's songs reflect Buddhist thought, the Zen that he studied. But I don't think anybody would come away from the book or even that chapter and say, well, these songs are really just mainly about Buddhism.
Right.
They're songs that have been influenced by Leonard's study of that discipline, but they're about many other things besides that.
So it's all sort of woven into that life story. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. The main message, or the biggest thing that surprised you when you were writing this book that came out of it for you?
That's a really interesting question.
Because I presume you might have gone into it with some preconceptions or some ideas of things that you thought you were going to write. Was anything that you just thought, wow, I didn't see this coming. This is really enlightening.
It's a hard question. And I'm not sure that the book really changed. I mean, I suppose I would have to fall back on this, the complexity of the man, which it's not that I didn't have some conception of that when I started the book, but it just seemed to grow, as more and more contributions came in, and the man just seemed more and more fascinating and multifaceted as I studied him and as I learned more about him. I mean, of course, editing this book was a learning experience for me because we have all of these experts. I mean, many of the people writing chapters in the book have written whole books about Leonard. They're really we have almost, not quite, but almost every leading expert on Leonard Cohen in the world in the book. There are a few significant omissions who didn't contribute, but most of them are here. And what I've learned from them, really deepened my sense of who Leonard is and how multifaceted he was.
And we can presume that most people listening to this are already fans of Leonard Cohen, but it sounds like the book has further reaching messages than that. Even just that of embracing older age. This is something that most people, fingers crossed, actually have to come and face at some point in their lives. So what would you say to people who don't know much about him to come to your book, what messages they can get from it, and also which one song should they start with if they're not already familiar with his work?
Well, let me start with the last question. I would say the song they should start with is Suzanne, which was the first song of his which was really a hit. Judy Collins recorded it in 1967, I believe, and then it became a hit for Leonard later. It's among his most well-known songs, but it's fallen a little bit down that list because of the popularity of some later songs, especially Hallelujah. But I would say that song is the one people should start with because it expresses the complexity of Leonard's spiritual and carnal interests. In this case, it's a fairly light take on the latter. It's not as explicitly sexualized as some other songs. Right. But it is also, it has the details in the songwriting. There's a line about Suzanne feeding you tea and oranges. It's those little observations that make Leonard's songwriting, I think, so powerful. And so this song really expresses well many of the most important aspects of his songwriting. And it also is very typical of his music. It's most of Leonard's guitar playing is rooted in Spanish style. It's actually pretty simple, but it's also distinctive. I mean, there isn't another, at least in the English-speaking world, I can't think of another performer who so consistently relies on that style of playing and performing. And Suzanne illustrates those sounds very well.
Absolutely right. And I'll try and get that song on after the break. And I know I asked you two questions, but I'm going to have to cut you off there because we're running out of time. But I do think that you have expressed that this book holds so much more than just a story about Leonard Cohen. It's got sort of life lessons, soul searching, all the rest of it inside it. David Shumway, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. If you'd like to get your hands on the book, it's called The World of Leonard Cohen, and you can find it on Amazon or the Talk Radio Europe bookshop. David, that's David Shumway. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much.